You're listening to Guardians of Galen, your go-to podcast for USC Trojan basketball.
Let's get started.
Welcome back to Guardians of Galen, your favorite USC basketball podcast. I'm your host, Casey Caslin, as the Trojans fall to their most heated rivals, the UCLA Bruins, in the first Big Ten edition of the classic rivalry, 82-76. A tough 6-point loss for Eric Musselman and company, and can't go without saying that the free throw misses at the end were very, very brutal for the Trojans in an opportunity to potentially tie and take the lead if they can hit some shots, and they just couldn't do that at the end in a tough loss that saw a lot of back and forth, momentum swings at the end, and a very kind of gridlocked first half that didn't really see either team capture on much momentum. So a tough loss for USC, and I think really the big story going into this one on the UCLA side was Tyler Bilodeau was questionable. He was a game-time decision. Of course, was injured early on in UCLA's win over Washington, was questionable coming into this one. Obviously, he is UCLA's leading scorer, a very good player for them, and had actually his career high in points against USC as a member of Oregon State last year. And so, losing a 14-point per game guy was something that the Trojans had on their side going into this one, but they still couldn't find a way to win. And when it was all said and done, the Bruin bench came through. And honestly, you look at the stats, it was pretty equal in terms of, most of the stats. Both teams turned the ball over 9 and 10 times, USC with one more turnover. Both teams capitalized off turnovers pretty well. Both teams rebounded well. I mean, there wasn't that much in favor of one team. USC actually did something kind of surprising to open this game. They made their first 5 shots from beyond the arc. So they had 15 points early on, all off threes, and then they started to sort of attack the paint more. But I think it was sort of a blessing and a curse because I felt like USC sort of struggled to attack the rim. They felt a little bit intimidated, and maybe that was playing up against a guy like Ade Mara, who is obviously a freak of nature inside the paint. And he had a great game as well, 12 points, a double-double with 11 rebounds, but he's 7'3", and the Trojans don't have that size, and so it seemed like they were hesitant early on to attack the paint, and that was sort of, an issue early on, and they forced them to shoot threes, of which they made a good amount of them early on. When it's all said and done, they made 11 threes, but they took 31. So just a little bit less efficient than UCLA in that category. But a big story tonight was Rashawn Agee really making his case for the 1A center on this team, scoring 21 points off the bench. That's a USC career high for him. Not a career high all time, but he was very, very good from, inside the paint. He was 0 for 4 from three-point range, which made him the worst three-point shooter of the game. However, I think really sometimes for him, I think when he overthinks things, he kind of hurts his game. I think when he hesitates, even sometimes not just from outside the arc, but inside the paint, when AG makes an extra step, he can sometimes be a little bit careless with the ball. But I think he certainly was amazing tonight inside the paint, going up strong when the Trojans needed him to. And I think he really is their biggest threat, given his size and skill and athleticism, when he doesn't hesitate and when he takes the ball up hard. And I think that's really a key moment for him tonight on many occasions in scoring 21 points. And I think really, I think the Trojans sort of thought they unlocked something with him, making multiple three-pointers last time against Nebraska. And I think that was big, but I will say, I think like he needs to stick to what he does best, and going 0 for 4 from three-point range doesn't help USC. That was a few empty possessions, and so that was something to take note of. Trojans, like I said, the free throws at the end were ultimately their demise. We can go through what happened at the end, but the Trojans were 11 of 19 from the charity stripe, and they had some missed free throws that were very impactful in this game. Wesley Yates, the third, missed a free throw, and that was with under 2 minutes to go, and if he made both, it would have tied the game. He only made one, and then it was 73-72, and then on the other end, Sebastian Mack of the Bruins hits a three, and then from there, it's all said and done. The Trojans lost, weren't able to do much. UCLA made 5 of its last 7 field goals, and that was the rest of the story. The Trojans only led at the very beginning of the game. It was 6-5 was their most recent lead. They trailed for almost the whole game. I mean, all but about 2 minutes. So a tough loss for USC, having to play from behind, and it was a very back and forth game. It felt like whenever UCLA made mistakes, USC would also make mistakes. Both teams kind of matched each other's energy. And so I think USC, struggled early, not just with capturing momentum, but sometimes playing unsimply, swinging the ball a lot when it wasn't necessary, not finding the open man. I mean, there were many occasions when I thought Wesley Yates was open on the perimeter and they couldn't find him. And it felt like the Trojans also had some careless early turnovers and they had to swing in transition really quickly. And that was a hard thing to do early on against a UCLA team that brought a lot of quick energy, even without their best player, and Tyler Bilodeau. Their leading scorer tonight was Eric Daly Jr., but I think really the player of the game for them is Ade Mara. He has a double-double, like I said, but 16 for Eric Daly, and he's their second leading scorer, had an efficient game. Dylan Andrews also with 12. Sebastian Mack with 14 off the bench was huge. For USC, it was 13 for St. Thomas, 4 of 10 shooting, played almost the whole game. Desmond Claude had 12. Not a great game for Claude. He had 3 at half. And I know he's a second half player. I've talked about it on this show before. Definitely a guy who can light up in the second half. And he did have 9 points in the second half. But I mean, I think for USC in a game like this, where you know you're going to go toe to toe, you have to have Claude wake up early and really wake up the whole way through. And didn't necessarily do that. Wesley Yates had a great game as well. He's been on a heater, of course, lately. 19 points, an efficient 7 of 14. Wesley Yates is, a guy that Trojan fans want to have for a long time. He's a redshirt freshman. He looks way beyond his years. Just to look at his game log, he scored 19 against UCLA. Last game against Nebraska had 17, had 11 against Wisconsin, 21 against Iowa. It goes on. He's had double figures for 8 games straight, and that has been huge in USC's success. He's really emerging as a guard who can support Desmond Claude, even in games like this, where the veteran Claude has a tough game and the younger rookie in Wesley Yates steps up and gets the job done. And I already talked about Rashawn Agee, but he had a great game and they needed that from him. The USC bench was short tonight. They only had 3 subs come in and Agee played 32 minutes. Kevin Patton and Clark Slackert only combined for 14 minutes. And so, of course, USC is operating with injuries, Matt Noling, Terrence Williams, it goes on. It's tough for Eric Musselman and, a new roster pretty much. So it's, a loss you should be upset about if you're USC because you should have won this. You're playing against a UCLA team that, is kind of streaky this year, isn't like a good team, isn't a bad team, missing their best player in Tyler Bilodeau, their highest scorer, a big guy for them in his first year as a Bruin, and they blew it. They had a chance, and that's heartbreaking, especially against a rival. Now, the big story going to this was Kobe Johnson, the former Trojan who has talked a lot since coming to UCLA. He's very pro-Bruins now, of course, being a member of them. He fouled out in this game with 7 points. That's basically his season average. He was 3 of 3 from the field, but didn't take many shots. Trent Perry, of course, a former USC recruit who was committed to USC for a while under Andy Enfield. He was 0 of 2 from the field, 0 of 2 from three-point range, but made 5 free throws, all 5. And so that was something to look out for. 2 guys who were kind of connected to USC in some way coming back. But I think really the interesting thing, and I've talked about this before, is Josh Cohen, being able to start games and win the tip potentially, but coming out. And I think that's an interesting role that's changed. He only played 8 minutes, shot 1 shot and missed. It was a layup he probably should have made. And I think Eric Musselman's starting to figure out where he fits in best. But I think really the big thing was Ade Mara, the center, 7-3, like I said, just being unguardable. I mean, he was hitting fadeaway shots. He was hitting shots inside with ease. He was making alley-oops. I mean, this was a 5-point game at halftime, and UCLA was shooting 68% at half. And so they played a pretty much flawless first half, making over 2/3 of their shots to only lead by 5. And their field goal percentage eventually declined a bit. They ended up shooting 55%, but that's a very admirable feat for a UCLA team that's playing against a Trojan squad that typically plays good defense. Another thing of note is the Trojans scored 76 points tonight. Previously, the Trojans were undefeated, 12-0 when scoring over 75 points. That streak comes to an end. And I think really just the big story is Desmond Claude needed to heat up, and he didn't. And when your first option is only scoring 12 points in all but 4 minutes of the entire game played, I just think that's not going to win you games. And I think even with Tyler Bilodeau being out, I think Claude just not really putting up many shots tonight is the story. And I think it gave Wesley Yates an avenue to score 19 points, but he also was missed a lot on open opportunities. Yates is a good 3-point shooter. He made 4 of 9 tonight, and he was open on the wing and on the perimeter many times, and they didn't find him, and that's something I noticed a lot. I thought Clark Slackert provided some good minutes. I know he's a player that's not really talked about much. 5 points off the bench. Just something to look at. We'll see if he gets more minutes going forward. He's made some big shots in recent games when he's called upon and can kind of play that, come in for a 3 type role and hit the bench again. But UCLA controlled the paint in this game on offense and defense. It felt like they weren't afraid to go up. They, were given free throw opportunities. They had 6 more free throws than USC, so fairly equal, but they made their free throws for the most part. They were 80% from the line. USC was under 60%, which is just unacceptable. If you're Eric Musselman, I'm sure he's very upset about that. Those are free points, and the Trojans couldn't take advantage in this game. But I think really for USC going forward, they have to avoid hesitating, flooding inside, and I think Rashawn Agee and Wesley Yates III do a very good job of doing this. But I think for the rest of the team, they often struggle and hesitate and make errant passes, struggle in driving inside and lose the ball, or just don't get good looks, maybe take bad fadeaways because they're sometimes afraid when they're on the perimeter with the ball to drive, take advantage of mismatches, and do what this team really does best, and that's scoring inside, especially Desmond Claude, a guy who's so athletic and such a good cutter. And him and Wesley Yates share those traits, but I think you want to have 2 guys who can do that, especially in a Musselman-led offense that really runs around the guards, rolling off the screens and whatnot. And so shout out to Rashawn Agee. He showed the true player he is. He's earned 32 minutes a game. I mean, he's not a guy who really this whole season played all that much early on, and I think really Josh Cohen not performing up to standards has sort of changed that. I mean, you look at Rashawn Agee's stat line, he was only really playing at most 15 minutes in that non-conference stretch, and then his minutes would increase with his production increasing, and he's a guy who can kind of do it all. Against Nebraska, he was 4 of 6 from three-point range, and I think that maybe, like I said earlier, inspired him to mix up his shot selection even more tonight, which isn't a bad thing for a player, in college and still learning about, how they play. But I think really Rashawn Agee should have just done more what he did best, and that was scoring inside. I'm not mad at him. I think really, he was their best player tonight, and that was obvious. But I think at the end of the day, 0-4 from 3 isn't great. One other guy I want to talk about is Chibuzo Abo, who struggled once again. Sort of an interesting downfall. I mean, I don't know if I want to jump to conclusions yet and say that, Chibuzo Abo isn't legit, because I think he has plenty of upside, especially from watching him at Boise State. He's still their second leading scorer at about 12 points per game and 5 rebounds. So, he adds some stuff to the table, but he's been kind of just shaky lately. Of 2 of 6 from 3 tonight, 0 of 4 last game from 3, 1 of 5 in the game before that. He hasn't made more than 2 threes since the Indiana game on the road, and that was, almost 20 days ago. So I think that's something to look out for. Abo's efficiency, he's just not really fitting that guard role. And I don't think it matters that he's playing guard, because obviously with Wesley Yates and Desmond Claude in the lineup, Abo is basically a forward at that point. They list him as a guard, but it doesn't really matter when it's all said and done. It just feels like Abo's confidence has dipped a bit in recent games. He, is afraid to shoot. And I think, there's 2 sides of it. I think, young shooters learn that, you just have to keep shooting even if you're in a funk. But I think for Abo, sometimes for him, he's taking the wrong shots. And then when he has the right shot, he's making that extra pass or hesitating or making a jab step he doesn't have to do. And so I think that's an interesting thing. But I think, in this game as well, it was nice to see St. Thomas's versatility show. He made some early threes. I mean, he missed 2 free throws that were big in this game. And so, 4 fouls as well. I think that's just, part of his game being physical. So I think in this one, the 2 players I just sort of had question marks about were Desmond Claude and Chibuzo Abo. I didn't expect much from Josh Cohen given his recent role, so I'm not necessarily surprised that he didn't get much opportunity, but I think that's something to look out for. Now, the Trojans' next game could be their hardest game of the year. They will host number 7 Michigan State, the top-ranked team in the Big Ten, and it's going to be a tough one for USC. I mean, we saw what they were able to do on the road against Illinois, so, it's basketball, anything can happen. But Michigan State is a very tough team, very, very good. That game, like I said, will be at 1:30 p.m. on Saturday, and Michigan State's undefeated in the Big Ten, have 2 losses overall, and one of them was to the number 1 team in the country, Kansas. So it just goes to show you how good this team can be. They have a guy in Jaden Akins who's scoring at will, especially inside the paint, and it's going to be a very interesting game. USC will just kind of hope to get out of that one unscathed and not lose too badly. I mean, it's going to be a tough one. Michigan State will play Minnesota before they play USC, and that will be on Tuesday this week. So be on the lookout for that. But that's going to pretty much wrap things up. A tough loss for USC, really to summarize. Missed free throws down the stretch, hesitation, and turnovers really were the downfall of USC. I mean, let's be real. 10 turnovers isn't bad, and USC capitalized. 15 points off UCLA turnovers. So USC was good on transition, but it was sort of that early tone that was set by UCLA that sort of tired out USC, forcing the Trojans to play from behind. And the Trojans did go on an 8-0 run to make this game close, but when UCLA was on, they were very much on and led by 12 at one point. USC cut it to 1 and just couldn't hit those charity stripe freebies. And that's something that all coaches are upset about in games like this where, you just have to make those freebies, and the Trojans didn't. But the Trojans will move on, try to have a short-term memory as the Big Ten schedule only continues. But that's just about going to do it here from Guardians of Galen. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. And it's a tough one for Trojan fans to swallow, especially, like I said, when you're playing a UCLA squad that doesn't have their leading scorer in Tyler Bilodeau. But you have to move on. So that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Guardians of Galen. 82-76, our final score from Galen Center in LA. I'll see you guys in the next one, and have a good night.